The reform kind of agenda will remain more or less in place?
Well, speaking of IMF, likelihood of IMF and the whole idea of the second IMF program, just right instead of the CFF, I think is logical. I think it's actually a pretty good idea, and I think it's feasible. It makes the whole, I think, progress with this BA feasible, rather than kind of waiting through the elections and doing the EFF afterwards. But again, speaking of the kind of correlation between the IMF and the elections, I can answer the previous question. I also tried to avoid naming any specific names. But I think this idea of politics doesn't really matter in the long term. I think I do like this idea, and I think it is the case. So eventually, of course, all reforms will be done and things will be great in the long term. But to get to this point long term, I think it's basically from the market perspective, at least, and we are sell-side people, buy-side, I think that's what's the most important. From the market perspective, the timing does matter, and the timing could be quite critical. So yes, we could survive. It'll probably, I mean, the country in general will be okay from the market perspective as long as SBA is around, but whoever comes on top after the elections, then of course I think it will still be important one way or another. I just wouldn't be overly complacent about that, even if the IMF will still be around. But because afterwards we will still need another program probably in 2020 going forward, right? Or maybe at least create additional framework of how to manage to deal with all these maturities going forward. This, I guess, for negotiations over yet a new program afterwards, we could have completely different starting points. If it's going to be the current government or the people who sound like the current government or the completely different people, in the end, in the long term, I do think that we all converge to, because the country cannot kind of survive and all, there's lots of pressures and all, and in the end, we'll probably converge to this IMF type scenario. So all these reforms will be done, the national bank will be fully independent and tight and all that. But basically the question is like whether or not between now and then, this perfect shining long term, there will be a period of kind of a market wobbling. That is something where the outcome of elections is important, and where this populism message or by some candidates could have an impact, I would say. In the long term, things should be fine, but not in the long term. Lots of things can happen.